I love how Republicans have spent the past 100 years talking about how important the Second Amendment is for protecting yourself against a tyrannical government. And then, and like now, when
That is
there's a
not
group of
it.
people actually like taking action against a government being explicitly tyrannical against them, suddenly they're not so much in favor of it.
Nice lie.
It's really interesting. Yesterday we were watching a not watching. We read a report on Barr's testimony talking about basically trying to isolate and create a perception of rioting as like this independent, totally separate, like astroturfed insurgent force
Good action.
that contrasts with like peaceful protests.
Shit.
And it's really important to be responsible about this and say, like, these are folks who are trying to overrepresent the level of rioting in general, especially looting. And, like, I'm never going to defend looting. I think that's just something people shouldn't do. It's creating victims out of people who genuinely shouldn't be, and hurts causes, and is just bad all around. All power and love to, like, people who have been looted and said, hey, don't worry about me, I'll rebuild my business. What the community is going through is a lot bigger.
Not bad.
I think that's really cool of them, but it's also, I don't think it's their obligation, right? And on the other hand, like, what Republicans are trying to do is they're trying to make rioting and looting the same thing while turning them into like these massive, I think, what was it, Tom Cotton? No, it was Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan took hundreds of hours of footage of police brutality and peaceful protest,
That was
and
way
he
off.
picked out like 2 minutes of like rioting and looting, and he cut those together out of like the hundreds of hours of peaceful protest. And I just think it's really, really funny because, well, first off, these guys are explicitly trying to create a revisionist narrative of what's going on right now around cities around the country, and what has gone on for the past 2 months. But I think it's really, really, really funny because these are supposed to be like the big Second Amendment, like you should be able to enact violence against an oppressive government. And now that the people that they don't like are doing so, suddenly it's a problem for them. But, you know, Republican hypocrisy at its finest.
That's the way I played it.
So our entire theory of government. So government is a weird concept because what you're basically doing is, you know, we have these. Most people consider ourselves to have some kind of moral rights. That we have these things like bodily autonomy, right to life, right to property, if you believe in the latter. And when you delegate powers to a government, you're giving up a lot of those rights, and
Not
you're
bad.
you're kind of doing it involuntarily. Because when you're born into a country, like, you don't choose what rights you're giving up. You just kind of give up those rights. And the entire justification behind it, one of the primary justifications, at least in American political theory, is that government exists in order to protect your rights from infringement by other individuals. And that by the end of the equation, more of your rights are protected through the existence of government than are taken away.
Come on. focus.
And this kind of bleeds into a political philosopher called Rousseau, who's one of the leading figures on political theory in the U.S. Who basically speaks of this of a concept called the social contract. And what the social contract is, it's a tacit agreement between the individual and the government that the individual is giving up rights to the government, specifically under the expectation that the government's going to use that power to protect the rights and general welfare of the individual. And that's the agreement that exists between any person who lives in the United States and their government, which is, I am kind of involuntarily having to give up these rights, but it's under the tacit understanding that, like, it is for my own good and that ultimately you work for me. Damn it. And the contract is,
Nice lie.
I am giving you the ability to infringe upon my rights, to prevent my rights from being infringed upon to a greater degree by other people, and that you're going to hold the monopoly of power and use it in a responsible way such that everyone has their rights protected. And that is the number one function of government, at least in a domestic sense. But no, also in an international sense, right? The whole point of foreign policy is you're supposed to protect your people from, from threats around the world. So from other individuals and other governments. When a government consistently and systematically violates the rights of the individuals it is supposed to protect, without really giving anything in return, it isn't really debatable that the government is in violation of that contract. And the entire design of our political system
Damn it!
justifies action against a government that is systematically violating your rights. Of course, that's why things like, peaceful demonstration and direct democratic action exist, which is that it is oftentimes very difficult to tell to what extent your rights are being violated and how dire the issue is and what the approach is. So oftentimes, and leaders within every community, and I will generally agree, will always say that peaceful demonstration is the best way to go. Not peaceful demonstration, that nonviolent civil disobedience is the best way to go, because from an optics perspective, it protects you against the propagandizing of the government. It is a way for taking on institutions without attacking people. And that's the whole point of Satyagraha, which is a slightly different issue. And we're not going to go too far into that. But at the same time, like, the political and long-term moral benefits of nonviolent action notwithstanding, that doesn't make violence committed in desperation against a tyrannical government, in a case as clear cut as this one, right? We're not talking about, like, to what extent do people have the right to bear arms. We're talking a basic moral right to life. And if the government's not protecting that, if the government is directly violating that for an entire race of people in this country, then by virtually every philosophical, legal, and political principle, it is completely justified to take action against, like, specifically against government institutions, right? There's no one's justifying violence against individual police officers, except maybe in self-defense, right? Like, all of the rioting, like the vast majority of rioting, let's say, has targeted police buildings and federal government buildings. If you're not able to take up arms against literal structures, not even individuals, then what were all those Republicans talking about when they were talking about, the eventual need to take up arms against a tyrannical government? This is probably the most justifiable and well-regulated form of violence against the government that is as justified as any form of violence against the U.S. government has ever been. So it really kind of baffles me, right? Like, what were all of these guys talking about? This is almost by every working definition justifiable violence and is being perpetrated largely against institutions and not people. This should be exactly like oh my god.
What?
It's fine. Bogey's not the end of the world. I just need to win.
Oh, yes.
So once you factor all of that in and you start to think about it, right? And it's like, okay, so these guys talked a big game about tyrannical governments. Then they don't seem to care so much about civilian action against government tyranny now. What's the distinguishing point? The easy point to see is they don't like it when the dissenters and the rioters are black. They don't like it when the protesters are black as well.
No, that is
They
not
don't like when they just don't like when black people say anything. That's obviously a through line, and there's definitely a racist, fascistic element to it.
Shit.
But then there's also like, you can't really approach this without taking into account the capital interest as well. And it just so happens that in a lot of these cases, capital has aligned perfectly with white supremacy, just because it's very easy to protect both at the same time. Not just so happens, like it's a structural flaw in capitalism for sure, but that is a definite alliance.
Not bad.
That like,
I swear this putter's bent.
I'm sure a lot of conservatives, a lot of the right, let's say, a lot of the right,
Ah, shit.
I'm sure a lot of the right supports white gun rights and doesn't support black self-defense, community self-defense rights, because like, one is good for their NRA donors and the gun manufacturers. And the other really is not.
That's the way I played it.
I think to a lot of conservatives, black gun ownership is likely to result in empowerment of communities that they want to stay socioeconomically repressed. Because you don't just serve the NRA, right? You also serve a lot of private capital. You have a lot of people who want to profit off of a lot of black poverty. So a lot of these people are racist. A lot more of them are just classist. And most of them are both.
Nice line.
Because it's really difficult to make declarative statements on this stuff, and you probably generally shouldn't, because it's tough to gauge. Like, are you racist, or are you just like trying to protect private capital, and it just so happens that the rural working class is a lot easier to mobilize in protection of capital than urban and inner city working people. And so you
Thank you.
want
and
to
good night.
create not false allies. You want to take advantage of rural white economic angst, but you don't want to take advantage of urban black economic angst, largely black, right? And so for a lot of these people, it just so happens that like for a lot of capitalists, for a lot of conservatives, you know, I don't want to say capitalist because I'm a capitalist, right? For a lot of conservatives, it's not necessarily a matter of oppressing any specific race. It's more just like there are certain kinds of working class people that I can use to my advantage and certain kinds of working class people I can't. And there's just a massive correlation, between people who are not amenable to economically right-wing messaging and the black working class, just because of the geographic placement of them, right? And then obviously, you know, the narrative is driven by white supremacists and corporate America just kind of, not corporate America, and American plutocracy just plays along because it works toward everything that they're working toward. Because white supremacy is just good for business. It's good for profit through prison labor. It's good for profit through wage cucking, through the exploitation of the black working class, and then the further exploitation of incarcerated black people. So yeah, it's hard to, going off the conversation we had yesterday about like, is Bill Barr a fascist, or is he just like a conservative authoritarian? And to a huge extent, that conversation doesn't really matter. He's a tool of neo-fascism, and he's an extremely effective one. And even if he thinks that he is able to maintain his end political vision, like I think, and most people who agree with me politically will think that like, no, there is no form of conservative authoritarian political change theory that does not wind up in fascism. I mean, most people on my side of the aisle would think that there's no neoliberal political change theory that doesn't wind up in fascism. So, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. But it's interesting to think about that. Like, yeah, I don't have a hard time believing that like Bill Barr is not really a white supremacist. He's just a sociopath who believes heavily in protecting the plutocracy, and that's what he's been doing since, like, I don't know when he entered government, like 1991 or 1989, whenever he entered the Bush administration, Bush 41. Like, that has been his project, and he is completely willing to play into Trumpian clown fascism, to play into structures of, you know, white supremacy in America, and the entire intention of it is to protect his vision of American oligarchy. And yeah, that's what it is, American oligarchy.
You got lucky, buddy.
and the opportunity to expand the right-wing authoritarian state to him is just a golden opportunity that he will seize on no matter what the quote-unquote moral cost is. I don't think he really considers, you know, I don't think this is definitely not somebody who sees the world in terms of any form of ethics, right? Like, I think what he is concerned with is the expansion and accumulation of power, and the enrichment of himself and his allies, and anyone who helps enrich himself, he will enrich in turn. I'm not sure what he believes in beyond that in terms of legacy. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I will have new videos every day. And if you'd like to participate in the discussion, come hit up my Twitch chat. I stream on Twitch live weekdays, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And yeah, feel free to come through, ask me anything, take part in the chat. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.